This is Tom Caldwell.
We have a few students who are still drifting in from their class, Victor, but I think we better go ahead and start. And we may have a few more students coming from their class here before we get very deeply into the morning. Well, welcome to all of you to this lecture featuring our visiting William E. Simon Professor, Victor Davis Hanson. It's a real delight to have Victor with us again this year. This is his second time to be with us as the Simon Professor. And we'd like for that to become a habit, maybe in a more permanent way. I told, Victor Davis Hanson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and we had another senior fellow from the Hoover Institution here yesterday, Secretary Condoleezza Rice, who spoke at the law school in the afternoon. Colleen Graffey, who's a visiting professor, was is interlocutor a good word for Colleen? Colleen was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under Condoleezza Rice and is teaching for us this semester. And then on the phone yesterday, I had a good conversation with another senior fellow, Michael Boskin, who is going to be our graduation speaker this semester. One of our graduates was with Condoleezza Rice yesterday, Ms. Hogan, who is one of our graduates of the School of Public Policy and is a research fellow, a research assistant to Secretary Rice. Another one of our graduates of the School of Public Policy is Assistant Director of the Hoover Institution, Jeff Jones. Another one is Director of Communication for the Hoover Institution, Aaron Witcher, who was formerly worked at the White House under Tony Snow. Tony Snow? No. Yeah, Tony Snow. So anyway, when I talked to Michael Boskin's secretary a couple of weeks ago, she said, you know, where is Pepperdine? So I explained where it was, and she said, well, it seems like they're taking over the Hoover Institution. David Davenport, of course, our former president, is a special counselor to the director of the Hoover Institution as well. So we're delighted to have Dr. Hanson here. For most of you, he will deserve no great introduction. For 5 years, he was a full-time farmer. I don't know where I got the 5 years. He was a full-time farmer for a number of years before joining California State University in Fresno in 1984 to initiate a classics program. I think, as I recall, Victor, you're the 5th generation on that farm, which is not too far from Fresno in Selma. And some of his writing reflects that history and that background and that appreciation and that insight. I'm not going to read off all of his awards. He's the recipient of a number of outstanding awards, both for his scholarship and for his writing. The one of which I'm most envious is the Bradley Award because of its generous financial benefit. He has taught at Stanford, at the U.S. Naval Academy, at Hillsdale. This is his second visit with us as a professor. And his bio officially says he's the author of 15 books. At home, I was glancing a couple of days ago, Victor, to one of your most recent one, The Father of Saul, and I thought I counted 20 titles on the inside leaflet of that particular book, of which he is the author, a couple of collections thrown in. So many of you will have read Mexiphoria, which was widely read several years ago, 2003. I mean, I think is going to be reissued if it's not already out in a revised and updated form. So it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you today. And the title that he has selected relates, I think, to his most recent book, and also the class that he's teaching this time, which is Savior Generals, Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I got a confession to make. I was at the Hoover Institution last week, and we do have a lot of employees of the liberal persuasion. And one of them came up to me thinking I was a sober, judicious, disinterested commentator and said, "I'm so sick of these Pepperdine people. You can't look, they're everywhere." One of them comes in, and I'll be frank with you, she was quite derogatory. She said, "They're like Mormons, they just take over a whole division." And I said, "Yeah, it's terrible." And she said, "You know," she mentioned all of the relationships that Jim just mentioned, and then she suggested that the director, his daughter had gone to Pepperdine, and Shelby Steele's son was there. And she said, "At least you're not having anything to do with Pepperdine." I said, "Well, actually, I'm teaching there this semester. My daughter's in the master's in psychology." She was very, very shocked that I had. The whole conversation was predicated invasion of the body snatchers. I had woken up and was one of the snatched now. But that's the feeling at Hoover, that it's becoming Pepperdine North. I like to think that Pepperdine is becoming Hoover South, but it doesn't seem to be that way. It's an asymmetrical relationship. I'd like to talk to you about leadership throughout the ages. I know that's a little bit pompous in 35 minutes. I'd be happy to have some questions afterwards. Most of us, when we talk about modern leadership, when we talk about youth that should learn the skills of command or responsibility, I think too often we deal with the superficial. Look somebody in the eye, be sure to network, project an aura of confidence, be well-spoken, be well-dressed. These are all important attributes. But to really understand why some people are successful in very dire circumstances and most are not, I think history is the only guide that we have. So I would like to go back and look at 2 or 3 situations where I guess we could call it situation hopeless, and yet a few rare individuals change the entire fabric of a war and indeed of world history. And I should make one more disclaimer. When we talk about war and salvation, every war there's a winner and loser. And that's not predetermined at the beginning, and there's ebbs and flows. So there's always going to be somebody who claims he's saved something. But I'm more interested in situations that are clearly lost, and they're clearly won by the efforts of just one person. And second of all, I'm more interested in the constitutional side of the equation. That is, people who fought in consensual and democratic societies. I could give a lecture about von Manstein and the brilliance of saving the Eastern Front, but he did so for the cause of Nazism. You could say that Austerlitz was lost in the morning and won 2 hours later by the brilliance of Napoleon, but the ultimate aim of that was authoritarianism. I'm more interested in more of the democratic ideal. First person I'd like to look at is the famous Athenian admiral-general-politician Themistocles. And this odd year he had in 480 BC. Let me just remind you, if you haven't seen the 300 lately, the reruns, what had happened in that year. The Persians had come in 490 and they had been defeated at a land battle at Marathon. Brilliant battle of Athenian farmers. The only city-state that helped them was a small little village of Plataea. They had won. Darius had died, and his son Xerxes said, "I'm going to pay them back like you would not believe." Literally, that comes out of the text of Herodotus. So he came back in the spring of 480 with somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 amphibious troops and a gigantic navy and a large army. It was the largest invasion of Europe until D-Day in June of 1944. They swept through Thessaly. We talk about Thermopylae as a grand last stand. It was a last stand. It was, in fact, a terrible defeat for the Greeks and Western civilization. They swept then from Thermopylae. They defeated the Athenians at the simultaneous sea battle at Artemisium. They came into the holy city of Thebes, took it over. The Thebes joined them. And by September 20th of 480, there was no Greece as we know it. Everything above Athens was occupied or had joined the Persians. All Greece consisted of was the Peloponnesus from Corinth south. I say it didn't exist. Athens was not only occupied by the Persians, but it was burned. And now what was the reaction of the Athenians? Most people thought, well, we beat them at Marathon, maybe we can go out and fight. One man said, if you fight, you're going to be obliterated, because this time they don't have 30,000, They have 250,000 troops. Others said, let's go down to the Peloponnese and join the Peloponnesian. We'll build a big wall across the isthmus. One man said, if you do that, then you're going to be isolated and you're going to be trapped without any recourse, and there's no harbors, there's nowhere you can fight them at sea. And then another group said, maybe we can have a grand reoccupation of the city and they'll have to besiege it. He said, we will be cut off. You can't hold out a city against 350,000 occupation troops, 250 to 350. And this went on and on and on. And finally, Themistocles made the argument the Athenians should evacuate the city. Think of it. When we talk about Kuwait City in the Gulf War being occupied, we talk about Paris being occupied in June of 1940, but there were still people in the city. The Athenians were not occupied by the Persians. They abandoned it, and the Persians obliterated it, and they went to Troitz and Egina, and especially the island of Salamis. So when dawn came on September 27th, the morning of the battle, there were Athenians on a rocky island. Have anybody seen Salamis? There's no natural resources. At my age, I can't stay outside one night. If somebody said, pitch a tent and a sleeping bag, I'd have trouble. But these people were sleeping out on the rock of Salamis, waiting for their salvation, while every other admiral wanted to retreat. And finally, by sheer force of will, this man named Themistocles said, we're going to fight here. And Eurybiades the Spartan admiral, began to strike him. He said, strike me if you will, we're going to fight. And he was able, by sheer force of will, to convince the Greeks to fight. And what were his arguments? They were very brilliant, but nobody wanted to hear them. They were simply the law of logistics. He said, the further and further we've retreated, we think we're in a bad situation, but they're further and further from Persia. And they have to occupy Greece as they go south. So 250,000 seems large, but it's a lot smaller than what they had, and it has to be supplied. And the clock is ticking against them just as us. And they cannot use their numbers if we fight in the confined waters of the harbor of Salamis. And although our ships are heavier and more cumbersome, that may be an advantage when you can't use their full force if we ram them. And he gave a series of arguments. And he was able to convince the Spartans, the Corinthians, and the other Peloponnesian allies to fight within the harbors of Salamis. He also sent messages to King Xerxes, who was perched on a throne, you can see it today, who was watching the battle, that if he didn't attack immediately, the Greeks might get away. That was a ruse so that he would come out ill-prepared. The Athenians met the Persian fleet. It was probably around 1,250 ships. The Athenian and the Greeks only had 350. And when the day was done, 80,000 Persians were killed, and it was probably the single greatest loss of life in any sea battle in history, even more so than Lepanto. And when it was over, the fleet of the Persians was crushed. Xerxes fled, and he left 200,000 soldiers without a fleet. And next year, the Athenians and Spartans beat them at the Battle of Petraeus, and the entire invasion was destroyed, and the rest is history. This ushered in an era of confidence and riches in what we call 5th century Athens. It was all done, though, by this very spectacular man. One man. I'm going to explain at the end how he did it, but I want to go to another example. We think that the Civil War was essentially over in 1864, because after all, in 1863, July 4th, 5th, there were two glorious battles, Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Ulysses S. Grant had split the Confederacy in two. The Mississippi was now entirely in the hands of the Union, and Robert E. Lee's army had almost been demolished at Gettysburg. There was euphoria that had swept the country. Lincoln was in control. He didn't have to be re-elected for another 15 months. And more importantly, he found a man in Grant who had a series of victories. He had never been defeated. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg. And he was going to bring this military genius to the east, assume command of the Potomac. He had a brilliant subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, and like punching gloves, one on the left, one on the right, were going to finally shatter the Confederacy. Grant came in May of 1864. Horace Greeley, the New York Tribune, all of the newspapers heralded the rise of this Westerner, and people said, the war is now in the hands of Westerners, frontiersmen, who can outfight these Southern aristocrats. So they said. Sherman and Grant worked out a plan that early May they would mutually advance, one on Richmond, one on Atlanta, and do the same thing as Gettysburg and Vicksburg the year before, but this time it would crush the Confederacy. Now the problem with this was that we are now in the third year of the war, and there had been a cumulative 200,000 people lost on the Union side. There had been draft riots, and the Union public could not fathom how a country with 22 million could not defeat a country of 8 or 9 million. In other words, Robert E. Lee and the Southern generals began to see they did not have to go north. They didn't have to win. They had a country the size of Western Europe that had to be defeated, occupied, surrounded. And that would be very hard to do for the Union. So the South had a new strategy of not losing. So Grant began his offensive in May. Sherman left Tennessee in May, and they each went toward the respective Southern strategic city. And then all hell broke loose in a series of catastrophes at the Wilderness, 7 Days, Spotsylvania, Petersburg, and most importantly, Cold Harbor. In a period of about 90 days, Ulysses S. Grant wrecked the Army of the Potomac. He lost 100,000 casualties. In fact, the army that had existed in May did not even look anything like it by August. And he had not taken Richmond, and all of a sudden, the glory of Grant was completely gone. Mary Todd Lincoln said that he's a butcher. Suddenly, George McClellan, who had been relieved 2 years earlier because of Antietam, which was technically a victory, he had gotten to within 7 miles of Richmond. Suddenly, McClellan was going around the country and said, at least I got to within 7 miles of Richmond. I surely didn't ruin the army the way Grant has. You couldn't find anybody in the Union who was for Grant or for Lincoln. And very quickly, there had been a political catastrophe. So close to victory, now victory so distant. And all of the New York papers turned on Lincoln. People in his own staff, Stanton, Seward, were all talking about running independent candidacies or stabbing him in the back. There was a congressional revolt. People thought not only would Lincoln not be reelected in November, there was some question whether he should even be renominated. John C. Fremont in late May had a radical Republican a third party, so to speak, running on the idea of a stern abolition, no more haziness about border states or any of that. Let's take the war to the South. But more importantly, George McClellan had recovered his entire political fortunes. Remember, everybody had said, well, we went through McDowell, we went through Pope, we went through Burnside, we went through Rosecrans, McClellan, then we got the guy Grant. Well, now that whole conventional wisdom was over with, because McClellan said, you should have stayed with me all along. If you don't want, I can get closer to Richmond at half the cost than Grant did, and I'm going to run for president. And he was running on the Democratic ticket. It was very ambiguous because the Copperheads wanted to have an immediate peace, and he said he kind of sort of wanted to, but kind of sort of didn't want to lose the war. It was an ambiguous position to hold. But nevertheless, everybody thought that if Lincoln were nominated, he surely would not win because Freeman would take votes from him on the, I guess I could use the archaic term, left, and McClellan would take it on the right, and the country did not like Lincoln. And all the newspapers except one had turned on him. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman is 2-3 miles a day heading toward Atlanta. And he's got a brilliant commander, Joe Johnson. He starts to surround him. Johnson retreats from Resaca. He surrounds him again. Johnson retreats, Johnson retreats, Johnson retreats. And by August, suddenly he was only 65 miles from Atlanta, and lo and behold, the Army of the West, 100,000 men, was growing. And people were criticizing Sherman. Grant's fighting, he's just said he's going to stick it out all summer if he has to. Sherman, slow, bogged down. And Sherman kept telling his subordinates, we cannot afford to do what Grant is doing. If we take the sort of losses that Grant does, the Union will implode. All we need to do is preserve the army, outposition them, and take Atlanta before the election. The Southerners were very exasperated with Joe Johnson and the terrible strategic blunder. They put in John Bell Hood, who delighted Sherman because he was a slasher and charger. Sherman was ready for him in a series of disastrous battles outside Atlanta. He lost over 30,000 men. in the Southern armies. And finally, on September 2nd of 1864, Sherman sent a message to Abraham Lincoln and said, "So, Atlanta is ours and fairly won." And he took the city of Atlanta, and all of a sudden you couldn't find anybody who was against Lincoln. Everybody said he was a military genius. Sherman had saved Grant. And then the next question was, okay, he took Atlanta, but he's 150 miles in Southern territory. He didn't destroy the army of Hood. It's still surviving. And what's he going to do with Atlanta? Well, Sherman said, I'm surely not going to sit here and occupy a shell and be attacked by my supply line. So he had already planned, as you know, on November 17th, right after the election, he headed parts unknown and ended up in Savannah. And then he got to Savannah and went up to the Carolinas, and that was the end of Robert E. Lee with 2 armies at front and rear. The point that I'm making is that had Sherman not taken Atlanta when he did, McClellan probably would have won the election. There's some controversy over the Electoral College, but it's pretty clear, I think, that he would have. And had he took Atlanta in the way that Grant fought, he still would have lost Lincoln the election, because it was intolerable for the public to have a simultaneous bloodletting on both fronts. But somehow, this crazy William Tecumseh Sherman was able to craft a strategy, withstand public criticism, and think of a larger picture that I have to get to Atlanta for symbolic purposes. It's a valuable transportation hub, but I cannot fight the sort of battles that Grant is fighting, and yet Grant is doing the Republic a great deal, because he's attriting in a ratio of 3 losses to Lee's 2, the terrible arithmetic, and I'm allowing him to do that by stopping reinforcements and by showing some movement. It was a brilliant policy that Grant didn't quite appreciate, but Sherman surely did. And finally, I want to give one other example of what I would call a savior general. It's a little bit more frequent in our memory. I think you'll know it better. It involves the Korean War. You know, we were very disheartened about Afghanistan sometimes, and Iraq, but I don't think there's ever been anything quite like Korea. If you remember, on June 25th, communist North Korean forces, probably with some early help from the Chinese and Russians, decided to cross the 38th parallel. Maybe because of Dean Acheson's rather careless remark that Korea was outside, he said, the American defense sphere. In any case, in a lightning advance, within about 6 weeks, there was no South Korea. Seoul was taken, and U.S. forces ended up at Pusan with a 50-mile perimeter. It was a period of widespread despair, because almost every single thing imaginable was wrong for the United States. People were reporting back from the front. They have something called a MiG-15 jet. It just destroys anything in our arsenal, not just our P-51s that operate so well, piston-driven planes, but we have these new F-80 fixed-wing jets, and they're outmatched by, of all people, the Russians. State communism can build a more superior weapon system than we can. And then commanders on the ground at Little Pusan said, it's not just that, we're still using Shermans, and then we're using Pershings, and they're still not as good as the T-34 tank. And we told people that. And people said, my God. And then the news came, the Russians had atomic bombs, and then people said, you know what, we're starting to hear about this new gun called an AK-47. Few people have it. My God, it's an assault gun, it's not a machine gun, and it's not a carbine, and it just outclasses the M1 and the M14. In fact, we wouldn't have an answer to it for another 15 years with the M16, and even then, that duel was ambiguous. And so it was just a period of rampant depression. We were going to write off Korea. All of the contingency plans said to withdraw from and to Japan. We disbanded our military. Lo and behold, the Pusan corridor held. And remember one thing about Douglas MacArthur, he could be very good or very bad. He's very good in 1944, and he was completely asleep at the wheel in 1941. The same was true of Korea. He was totally surprised by the invasion, and yet he was about the only person who didn't lose his head and planned an amphibious invasion behind North Korean lines at Incheon on September 15th. Against all the advice of the Joint Chiefs, he took the risk, it was successful, and lo and behold, they had trapped the entire North Korean army 300 miles in the south. Only 25,000 or so troops escaped. and MacArthur was off to the races. Immediately in July, August, September, he said that it was time to unite North and South Korea. Today, people say MacArthur was crazy, he was exceeding authority. We know now that, in fact, Truman and Marshall essentially gave him a green light, explicitly in the case of Marshall. He crossed the 38th parallel, he went another 300 miles, and by October he was within 15 miles of the Chinese border, and the Korean War was essentially over with. Probably the most brilliant military campaign in American history. MacArthur met, as you know, Truman, Wake Island. He said everybody's going to be home for Christmas. There were people like Matthew Ridgway, who was Assistant Chief of Staff of the Army, were very worried, because if you look at the map of Korea, it starts to get more difficult geographically and topographically as you go north. It starts to widen as you go north, and people, Korea is not Asia in the sense of the stereotyped American view of palm trees. As you get north, it gets frigid. And so there were people who were warning MacArthur, you've got a greater territory to occupy. Your lines of logistical supply are now 400 miles. You've got the UN, but you've told them the UN can participate, but they think they're participating as peacekeeping troops of a war that's already over with, and you've got constant threats from the Chinese. MacArthur said, don't worry, they don't have air support, they would never intervene, Stalin won't let them do it, it's whatever. And of course, on October 25th, 350,000 Red Army soldiers crossed the Yalu River, and ultimately, perhaps somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million came. And they overwhelmed U.S. forces, and all of the exuberant, hysterical happiness and confidence and triumphalism and chauvinism almost within hours changed into rampant defeatism. MacArthur was pushed all the way back, 300 miles back across the 38th parallel, and more importantly, he was outnumbered. It was the worst defeat in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. We lost in one day 3,700 people killed, November 11th, and we had 10,000 casualties within a week, and by Christmas Day there was 14,000 dead Americans who were on the verge of victory. Everybody said that this was a bad idea, MacArthur is to be blamed. MacArthur, of course, said Truman is to be blamed. He called for 25 nuclear bombs to be given in his control. There were some questions, should we use poison gas? We can dump radio waste, let's have B-29s bomb. There were all of these desperate, angry exchanges between the Truman administration, that was a lame duck administration, and Douglas MacArthur. Suddenly on 24th, the senior ground commander, remember, MacArthur's in Tokyo, he doesn't know what's going on. He's the theater commander, but General Walker was killed in an accident. He'd been a division commander, a corps commander under Patton, and we needed to replace him. And who wanted to go to Korea and be blamed for being there when the theater was lost? So on December 25th, Matthew Ridgway, who's 55 years old, just about ready to retire, had a distinguished record in Europe, but was an outspoken, kind of a tough guy, 6'3", looked like Captain America, but he'd been married 3 times. He just married a 25-year-old woman. He was pretty happy. He was ready to retire. He didn't have a great heart. He'd never been to Asia. He spoke Spanish. His knowledge was about Europe. He gets a call at a cocktail party and said, sorry, you're going to go take over Korea. He said, fine, want to do it. 24 hours later, he was in Tokyo. 12 more hours more, he was on the ground, and he was facing 750,000 Chinese and North Korean troops, and with a completely destroyed 8th Army and demoralized Marine Corps. And it looked like a catastrophe. He looked to MacArthur for advice, and MacArthur said, 8th Army is yours, Matt, do what you want. What kind of advice is that after you've lost an entire theater? And as you know, he couldn't do much in the first week, and Seoul was taken. And this juggernaut kept going, and everybody, his division commander said, it's time to go back to Pusan, this time to get out, because these are supermen. There was a strange idea of the Chinese that they attacked at night, they used bugles, they kept off the roads. We still did not have the F-86 for a couple of more months, so we didn't have air superiority. B-29s were taking a beating, and people were saying This new ideology, when married with traditional Chinese discipline and order, is a new phenomenon. We can't defeat it. And Ridgway went throughout the line, and he started to notice some certain things. He did this almost immediately. Number one, if logistical lines were too extenuated in our circumstances, and we are a sophisticated industrial power, surely they're the same with China. It's operating in reverse just like it did in June. They're coming down, and now they're 500 miles from the Chinese border, and their lines will be extended. And as soon as the F-86 gets here in numbers, and it will in 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to get a squadron from Japan. We will have air superiority. The B-29s can bomb at will these supply lines. He went through his division commanders. He said, I do not want to hear any talk of defense, retreat, maintenance. I want to know what your plans for offense are. He went to his soldiers and said, this is where the word bug out came from, the great bug out. Everybody was making fun of the American soldier. And he said, I would have bugged out too if I didn't have proper winter clothing, mail service, chow, and my division commanders were 10 miles behind you. From now on, every division commander is going to be at the front with you. You're going to get hot food. You're going to get supplies. And even though we criticize the Pershing tank and we criticize our fixed-wing aircraft, within 3 to 4 weeks we will have comparable or better weapons. And we are going to do to them what they did to us. Everybody thought he was crazy. And in a series of offensives, and think of the names, Operation Roundup, Operation Killer. People got very, very kind of, who's this guy? He was supposed to go over to Korea and stop the killing and get down to Busan and get out. And now he's talking about Operation Killer. And he wants to go on the offensive. And MacArthur tried that. And of course, in 100 days after coming onto the Korean soil, he had taken Seoul back, and he was across north of the 38th parallel, pretty much where the war ended 2 years later. What do all these generals have in common? I could mention many others. Curtis LeMay, who saved daylight bombing and then saved B-29 strategy in World War II. There's a number of people like Belisarius, the great Byzantine general who saved Justinian's view of taking back North Africa. Scipio Africanus, Second Punic War, took the war home. What do these people all have in common? Is there any commonalities across time and space that would allow us to get any insight into leadership in the present? Well, they did have some commonalities. The first is that they were one with their men, and I mean that literally. They were not, MacArthur looked like an aristocrat. Matthew Ridgway, they called him Old Iron Tits. He had a live grenade on one chest and a medicine pack on the other. And he dressed in the he was almost indistinguishable except for 4 stars from an average soldier. And he was out, he flew on a light plane, he was shot down once, almost killed. And he intended to use his grenade, but people saw him everywhere. Themistocles rode with his men at Salamis. Really got into it, and he was the one that was chanting Eleutheria, Eleutheria, Eleutheria. Freedom, freedom, freedom. We know that Sherman looked like a Slav. In fact, we have a letter from a Union soldier, and they said, we want to know where Uncle Billy is, but all you got to know is when you see somebody who's got the dirtiest uniform and that red hair, and he's got this ugly cigar that's chewed up, you know it's Uncle Billy. That was their supreme commander of the Army of the West. So one commonality was that these generals at least felt their men would not fight unless they were going to fight alongside their supreme commander, not their division commander, their supreme commander. In fact, these 3 individuals were closer to the front than their subordinates were. The second is, we think that you have to network, you have to be well connected, you have to have an aristocratic background. All 3 of these people in various degrees were shady characters and not liked by their peers. And for accents of history, they probably would have never gotten command. Themistocles was a half Athenian. He was Thracian. He was a demagogue. People thought that he was capable of anything, saying anything or doing anything in the assembly. In fact, Plutarch's life of him is really a story about why you don't want to turn politics over to a rabble-rousing non-Athenian from the lower classes. Sherman was an orphan, and he had been adopted by and married his foster city. They were quite, the Ewing family was quite wealthy, but everything that Sherman had tried 20 years prior to his march on land had been a complete failure. He tried banking in San Francisco, failed. He tried to be a teamster, he tried to be a farmer, he tried to be a storekeeper. Failed, failed, failed. Why? Because he suffered from asthma and manic depression. Well, we know that now. So he would be either very ill, or he'd be up all night ranting and raving, or he could go into periods of long depression. Finally, in 1859, a little thing called the Louisiana, it was a new military college. It would become LSU. They gave him the superintendentship. He did very well, and guess what? Given Sherman's luck, the war came along. All he had to do was to say, I'm neutral, and continue to be a very distinguished college administrator. Instead, just when he had found it, he resigned and went north, fought at Bull Run. His brother was a senator. And then they gave him command of Kentucky, a key border state, Kentucky and Tennessee theater. And what did he do? He started to have these moods again, and he said, usually manic depressants are very brilliant people. They have visions the rest of us don't. He said, my God, you're going to need 1 million people, and this war could go on for 4 years. Well, nobody wanted to hear that. The Union Army was supposed to be 3 months and 75,000 armed men. And the Cincinnati Observer had a headline by 1862, Sherman insane, crazy, and relieved, and he had to go home back to Ohio, and his career was over. And luckily for him, he recovered, his health improved. He befriended Ulysses S. Grant, whom he outranked, and at Shiloh he woke up surprised, and he went to bed as a national hero, being shot, having 3 horses shot from under him, his hand shot, and the rest is history. But he was a very erratic figure. Matthew Ridgway had crossed everybody in the U.S. military. In the Anzio campaign, there was a crazy idea to have an airborne parachute attack on Rome with just 1 division. And it was all set to go to Ridgway literally woke up and said, I can't allow my men to be slaughtered, and canceled it, which Mark Clark never forgave him. He got on the wrong side of Dwight Eisenhower. So much, think of this, great Eisenhower that everybody quotes today as the father of our country, the model of bipartisanship. When Eisenhower wrote his memoirs, he hated Ridgway so much that he said in March, when we retook Seoul, General Van Fleet, in his brilliance, retook the city. General Van Fleet hadn't even been appointed yet. He didn't even want to mention that Ridgway had taken Seoul. In fact, Ridgway, his entire career, he said the wrong thing in the wrong time. Politically, intellectually, and philosophically, always the right thing. He said, I would not go into Vietnam if I were you. And this got people, Eisenhower took his advice, but people like Maxwell Taylor, the Kennedy, people got very angry. And then when we were in Vietnam, he said, I wouldn't get out of Vietnam if I didn't leave. Bad idea to get in, worse idea to leave. Shame. He was a champion for interracial and integration of the military. And everybody thought he would be in his 80s and 90s at the forefront of having women in the military. He said, nope, we don't want women in combat. And that just enraged the left as much as they had championed him on the racial question. He didn't get the Medal of Freedom till he was 95 years old. And the only reason he got it is Reagan needed somebody who would go to Bitburg and stupidly shake hands with a German general after he didn't notice that there were SS soldiers in this cemetery buried. And finally Ridgway said, I'll do it. He did it, he got the Medal of Freedom, and immediately the New York Times and Washington Post said, Ridgway sells out his soul at 95 to get the Medal of Freedom. So he had a very checkered and tragic life that stood the other two. Finally, I think most importantly, they were visionaries. That's a very promiscuously used word. But what I mean by that, their mind was never at Themistocles. Themistocles' mind was never at Salamis alone. Sherman was not thinking about, I got to get to Atlanta, then I go into retirement. Ridgway was not thinking, I take back Seoul, my career is cemented. I think a lot of people think that way. Their ideas were larger, and I'll give you an example of what I mean. Themistocles' idea was simply, this is a radical democracy. It's new in the Greek world, and yet half the population is not participating militarily. Military participation is the essence of ancient citizenship. Marathon was a great land battle by the landowning classes, but it's not going to save the city, because next time they come, they're going to come with 250,000. So when silver was found at Lorient 2 years before, in 482, everybody said, let's distribute it. And Themistocles said, no, let's build a fleet. And people said, well, why do we need to build a fleet? We beat the Persians. And he said, okay, Egina, that island over there might attack us. Of course they weren't, but it was a way of getting a fleet built. If you have a fleet, wonderful things happen. The lower classes participate, they're paid a state wage, they have employment, they get prestige, and there's a greater balance within the city-state. And if you have to evacuate land, then you have an option if you have a fleet. If you don't have a fleet and you are outnumbered at land, you're going to lose your land army and you're going to lose your city itself. He came up with a brilliant idea that, and it's quoted in the historian Thucydides, but it's derivative of Themistocles, that a city is made of people, not walls, not infrastructure, people. And if the people survive, then the city can survive. They call him Themistocles a polis, without a city. They were so angry at this radical concept. But in other words, Salamis was a tessera in a larger mosaic. If you look at Sherman, quite brilliant. In his memoirs and letters, he realized very quickly that this war had started with rifled muskets and mini balls, which were quite lethal compared to the old Brown Bess type of musket. But it was morphing at a phenomenal rate. They were starting to have explosive cannon shells, rubber ponchos, canned food, railroads, telegraph. Henry and Smith's repeating rifles where one man could shoot 27 bullets a minute if he could load his clip quick enough, whereas it used to take 5 or 6 with a musket. The appearance of some rapid shooting guns. And Sherman said the old idea of courage has to be redefined. And more important, you can't just charge fixed positions as Grant is doing, because even if you win, it will be a Pyrrhic victory. And more importantly, he came up with the idea of total war. I don't mean total war of killing people, because he killed very few Southerners. But he came up with a radical concept when he went to Atlanta. And it was basically could be distilled as this. Look at the Civil War in cultural, political terms and social terms. Don't just look at it as Lee versus Grant. 3% of the South have slaves. 3%. What's moral about a bunch of poor white people going up in Virginia and getting killed to protect slavery of the 3% that own it? Why not bring the war home to the people who own property, the plantation class, especially in the richest of all states, Georgia, and make them pay, or as he said later, make Georgia howl. And that was a radical concept that was considered unfair, and attack the infrastructure of the South, their arsenals, their post office, their government buildings, but do not kill Southern soldiers. And so what he did is he started to undermine the cohesion of the South. Because as Sherman went down, he humiliated the South, he humiliated the plantation class, but he didn't kill the white working class that was fighting, they thought, for Southern nationalism, but as became clear, they were fighting for what? A plantation class that had sold them out. More importantly, there had been a myth of Southern superiority in battle. These were the cavalier class. Sherman said, the cavalier class are plantationists. They don't sleep outside. They don't work like you do. Now, maybe they're better soldiers than people who get off the boat in New York. I mean, I have relatives that did just that, so I don't want to deprecate them. But he was saying, we have soldiers from 4 states. 90% of his regiments came from Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa. And these are small homestead farms. They like camping out. They like shooting. They like butchering pigs. They're more muscular, they're stronger, they're better than anybody in the South. The Southern poor are not farmers. They're sort of a ministerial class that attends to the plantation. They have no middle class. My army will go down there and show people in the South that Northerners, albeit Midwesterners, are better soldiers, tougher people, like fighting more. And he demonstrated that. And that was psychologically devastating. In other words, total war was exactly what it is implied. A cultural, social, psychological war in a way that Grant had not fathomed. And finally, Ridgway was a visionary, because when he took over command, he was shocked at what American strategic thinking under Dwight Eisenhower and a series, Lewis Johnson and a series of Secretary of Defense. Remember, we had 4 Secretary of Defenses in 13 months. And what was the strategy? Because the atomic bombs had ended the war abruptly in Japan, there had been this idea that we didn't need conventional forces anymore. That any war would naturally escalate into a nuclear exchange, and therefore we could disband, believe it or not, Lewis Johnson advocated disbanding the Marine Corps. We could dismantle conventional forces. We didn't need aircraft carriers, and the result was by 1950, there really wasn't a conventional deterrent. Matthew Ridgway alone had been writing and speaking and saying, you don't understand, when the Soviet Union got nuclear weapons, and because of the horrific nature of them, they cancel each other out. Neither side will necessarily resort to them, and then how are you going to fight? And there will be fights, given human nature. And the only way you can fight in this new circumstances are conventional, limited wars. And people didn't, that was just, Americans fight to win. And Ridgway tried to teach people that you, unlike MacArthur, that you will have to fight a war and defeat a person, but it won't be necessarily adjudicated in traditional terms given the specter of nuclear weapons. And so when he got back across the 38th parallel, you can argue that he should have gone all the way back to China. People can argue back and forth. But he said something, because again, like Sherman and Themistocles, he was thinking socially, politically, culturally. This new affluent American populace, do they really want to supply an army on the Manchurian border right next to the Soviet Union and China for the next 50 years? I think the answer was no. And so he created the entire concept of limited conventional wars, and thanks to Ridgway, the United States rearmed and was able to protect in a conventional sense its assets and allies in Asia and Europe. Do we have any savior generals on the horizon? I think we do. I was struck the other day, and I'll leave on a semi-partisan note, I don't want to be too partisan, but I was listening to the comments on Egypt. And if I could collate what Vice President Biden, Secretary of State Clinton, and President Obama said about Egypt, I think it would be fair to say they said the following over a 14-day period. Mubarak is a dictator, non-dictator. He has to leave immediately, yesterday, soon, very soon, occasionally, sometime in the future. And he has no role to play. He's a transitional figure. He's a key transitional figure because at some point the Muslim Brotherhood should not participate, should participate, must participate. And I thought to myself, where have I heard these three people before? I thought, bingos! Of course, September 2007. Who was there in the Senate? General David Petraeus. What had he done? Single-handedly, he had created a movement within the Pentagon against all of the wishes of the Joint Chiefs, against the wishes of General Abizaid, who had been, sort of forcibly relieved of command in 2007 in March, General Casey, and he had this idea of counter-insurgency warfare rather than counter-terrorism. He had some support in the National Security Office, people like Fred Kagan and Jack Keane. In other words, he was saying that the war in Iraq is not lost. Even though the dome in Samaria had been blown up, the casualty figures per month were spiking, and he's made the argument that the limited footprint, Abizaid, Casey, Rumsfeld, all great men, but they had said that the reason we have insurgency is because of our high profile. Petraeus almost alone said, no, the reason we have insurgency is that people can't participate in rebuilding the country because they're going to be killed at night while we're sleeping in a bunker outside of town. So we have to take these people and we have to put them all over Iraq in teams of 2 and 3, and we have to surge maybe 30,000 troops. That's not enough really to change the tide, but psychologically it'll be important. It'll send a message of determination. And this was a time when George Bush's approval ratings were 32%, 66% were against the war. And it started to work, although Petraeus said, as we surge and as we get out of our compounds, we're going to suffer higher casualties. The American people did not want to hear in a campaign cycle that some general was going to overrule his superiors and the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense and call for more troops back up to 165 when we promised to be down to 110, and this was going to make, it was counterintuitive, it was going to make things better by more fighting and more troops in a lost war. So these three senators, who are now the architects of American foreign policy, in a very famous September 10th, as you remember, that day you woke up and the New York Times gave a discounted ad to MoveOn.org called General Petraeus, Secretary Clinton, 15 minutes of questioning, said, General Petraeus, I've concluded that your testimony requires a suspension of disbelief. In other words, you're an out-and-out liar. Joe Biden said the war is lost, General. And I've been over to Iraq, and the only way that will save the country is divided into threes. And I'm moving a motion in the Senate. You're completely wrong. I know much more about Iraq than you do. It became the turn of Barack Obama. He talked for 8 minutes and didn't ask one question, but said the war was lost and the surge had made things worse. Within 3 months, American casualties were down to less than 15. We had the Anbar Awakening in all of 2008. As the war started to stabilize, it became no campaign issue. And I think you could argue that one man, almost by sheer force of personality, was able to turn around an entire war. Did he fit that profile that I talked about? Yes. You talk to people about General Petraeus, and they didn't particularly like him. They called him a networker, a kiss-ass, married the superintendent's daughter, etc., etc. Operated outside of channels. Was he one with his men? I went to Iraq twice. Once I walked, they said, well, what did you think of David Petraeus? He talked. I said, that was David Petraeus. They said, yeah. I said, how would I know? And they said, well, he has his name Petraeus here. He didn't look any different. And the next day when I interviewed him, I said, well, I'm going to go out with Colonel McMaster. When should I come back? Well, you'll be back about midnight. So I said, well, I guess we can't meet. Oh, no. We'll have a 1:30 in the morning interview. And I said, well, yeah, but we have to get up at 6. He says, well, I'm going to get up at 3. How many push-ups do you do, Mr. Hanson? And I said, not very many. He said, well, I'm a year older than you. I know that. Well, he was a very combative, eccentric person. And now I will leave you with one fast one. Do these guys end up well? Because I've made the argument that they're eccentric, and they're sort of like when we get in a jam, we open the closet and we bring these unattractive people out. And we say, George Patton's or Sherman's, we say, please restore things. And then when they restore them, we put them back in and say, I didn't have anything to do with that night. And I wish I could say they end up well. But Themistocles committed suicide in service to a Persian satrap, the once enemy. And General Sherman mostly presided over the grand reunion of the Army of the West and said he didn't want to run for president, and said a lot of really wild things, and spent the next 20 years in constant controversy with people. Matthew Ridgway, as I said, was not given very many honors. He was promoted when when MacArthur was moved in April. He had that job, General Van Fleet, and he fought back and forth. He was made Supreme NATO Commander. The Allies complained about that he was anti-European, and he had a checkered career, as I mentioned. I don't know how this bodes well for General Petraeus, but when I read that Iraq had been secure, General Petraeus had fainted at a hearing. General Petraeus had prostate cancer. General Petraeus was asked to go to Afghanistan. I said to myself, here we go again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is that on?
Just a second.
I don't know if we have enough time or not.
Let's take 10 minutes out of your lunch hour, if you want to do that, and take a couple of questions, and I'd like for you to have a little bit of opportunity to respond here. Let's try to get these, you want to take this?
We're going to.
Raise your hand back there.
Thank you, Dr. Hanson. I think it was the Korean War where the famous quote, and I don't know who to attribute it to, we're not retreating, we're just attacking in another direction.
Yeah.
And it was implicit in everything that you said, but perhaps you can expand on it just a bit. It seems like all of these men had a really true insight and appreciation for logistics.
Yes, they did.
And Napoleon said an army travels on its stomach. And I'm thinking too of General Washington, Valley Forge, in the winter of 77 and 78. And how they didn't really engage the British troops. They just seemed to retreat, and then they would attack, and then they'd fall back again. And that's the kind of war that they wage. Perhaps you could
Yeah, but
address that a
in
bit.
fact, that's a very good point, because, as you know, when Sherman was going to Atlanta, what was he doing at night when you see these pictures of him scribbling? He was computing the number of rail cars that could reach Atlanta and how much food and ammunition they were bringing. And then when he decided to cut his supply lines and go to Savannah, he had all the logistical problems figured out to a T. Same thing with, first thing Ridgway addressed when he got to Korea was the lack of winter uniforms, the lack of hot food, the lack of ammunition, and especially weapons parity. He tried to explain, they had the 3.5-inch bazooka to counter the T-34. They wanted an up-armed Pershing tank with a 90mm gun. They got the F-86. And the point was, he's saying we have to have better equipment and more of it than the enemy. So yes, that's a very good point. Logistics were key to all of these commanders. I had a question over here.
Thank you. It sounds like, from what you've been saying, that in the character to be a savior general, there is required a certain level of respectful, but at the same time prudent interface with your superiors. And I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about how that has evolved over time, from ancient Greece, the Civil War, to the era of Petraeus and McChrystal. Has there been a consistency in how members of the military deal with their superiors in periods of disagreement, and if there are any outliers to that effect?
Well, your question is predicated on the notion that the best minds are not always 4-star generals. So then what do the 3-star, 2-star, 1-star colonels do? And there's parameters in which they have to work in. If they're yes men and they're head nodders, I won't mention names, but there's many of them in the U.S. top ranks of our officer corps, then they're never going to distinguish themselves. They may end up a 4-star and retired, and we'll never know who they are. Most of the 4-star generals today got to be 4-star generals by not making waves. They got a good retirement, and it didn't matter whether they existed or not. So the savior generals, or the mavericks, or the eccentric generals have to work within, obviously if they swear, or they're a commanding officer, or they mouth off the press, their careers will be aborted. All of these people, as I said, Themistocles and Sherman and Ridgway came close to that. So I think the answer is that they had a vision that at some point their talents would be needed when nobody else wanted the job, and nobody else's traditional curriculum would be of advantage, and they would be, as Goethe said, everything will happen to a man if he just waits. But they had to be in a position of that, and they had to have walk the fine line of being known as eccentric and a maverick, somebody like Pétain in World War I, for example. And yet they had to be also known as somebody who was not offensive, that people, you know, just shunned to the side. Sometimes Patton crossed that line and cost us dearly when the slapping incident meant we didn't have him in Italy, when he would have done things that Mark Clark could not have done, cost thousands of American lives, because he went over that line, and he was that same type of maverick figure. I think if I were to sum up, though, in general, I think what I would call essential to these men is a tragic view. The tragic view of life suggests that things don't happen the way we want. And a person lives their lives according to certain values, and he lets society decide how it's going to end up. There's a sense of fatalism. All of these men did not clamor for the job, but Ridgway's attitude was, they've got themselves into a mess in Korea. I know how to get us out. People know that I know how to get us out, but they don't pick me. It's tragic, but I'm not going to change my attitude or my tactics or my strategy so they will pick me. I may end up nobody. Themistocles knew exactly what would happen, and he also assumed that after he won, people would treat him very terribly given his character and background. Sherman realized that at Shiloh he was kind of crazy, and he was going to do what he did, very heroically get out in the front lines. If he got killed, that's what happened. He said that in a letter. I may be killed, but I have to prove that this is the way that William Tecumseh Sherman's not crazy. So I think in all of our lives, the message to us is that You live your lives according to certain principles and protocols with the understanding that life's not fair. And you probably have no chance to shine, but you're not going to change anything. However, that every man and every woman at certain rare moments in their lives, chance happens that it favors them for a split moment, for a week, for a month, and you have to be ready. And that's what they were. They were ready to take advantage of circumstances that they did not create. And they were waiting, almost like a lion or a predator, waiting for things to happen, and when that moment came, they took it. But they were perfectly willing to be rejected if it meant that they had to be true to the principles. And Sherman, I don't know how you would command Sherman. I don't know how you commanded Patton. I wrote an article once on Curtis LeMay. My father flew 40 missions over Tokyo in B-29 under him. And my God, I mean, this is a man that, he said that Polaris submarines have no business with missiles on it. Missiles are an Air Force prerogative. That's SAC. And I said, no, General LeMay, there's a new system. No, you go down to those Polaris missiles and you write S, Strategic Air Command, on every one of those damn submarines while they're sleeping. And they brought the M16 out and said, we don't want the M16, we have to use the M14. No, you take every Air Force soldier and they're going to have an M16. I mean, he did things like that. And then he ended up running, for vice president with George Wallace. So he's the kind of person you wouldn't want in this room, but you wouldn't not want him when you needed to bomb Tokyo. Or,
Maybe one more.
One more space.
There's one here.
There was a factor in particularly MacArthur's case that I lived through, unlike most of the audience. I was old enough to be in Korea. And I remember when MacArthur was relieved of command and came back home, parades were organized for him. He was regarded as the great maverick. Truman was regarded as the traitor, and that word traitor was used. And I don't remember Ridgway coming across as the brilliant maverick. MacArthur was able to twist his relieving from duty as being somehow or other his getting stabbed in the back by those crummy politicians, Truman and Atchison, who didn't know anything about the military. And I remember MacArthur riding down Sheridan Road in northern Illinois on a sort of a victory lap, and hundreds of thousands of people gathered around the roadside, paying him homage as you went by. How does that square with
No, it's absolutely right, with one caveat. Remember that MacArthur was leaving, I think it was on April 10th, 1950. So, as I said, it was 107 days that Ridgway was actually the senior commander on the ground. And it was very unfair because when Operation Killer and Operation Ripper and Operation Roundup started to work, MacArthur had a very bad habit of flying in to Seoul after they retook Seoul, and then right in the middle of the offensive when it started to work, to give a press conference and say that it was his idea, even though he had no idea what was going on. Finally, Ridgway did not know how to deal with him, and he wrote a little note and said, being the great patriot you are, the enemy is watching your movements, because you're key to my success, and when you come to Korea, they know that the offensive is going to go on, so please don't come. And MacArthur accepted that. But Ridgway was in a very impossible situation, because on the one hand, he felt that he could get back across the 38th parallel without a nuclear war and stabilize the theater, and yet he was very sympathetic to MacArthur's obvious skills and obvious patriotism, and he was very aware that people in the U.S. State Department were very naive about the perils of communism, and he was very aware that MacArthur was his own worst enemy. So what he basically did was let MacArthur fight with Atchison back and forth and Marshall, and he won the war on the ground, and then when MacArthur was relieved, he was kicked upstairs in April. But when I said caveat, there were two Time magazine front pictures where he was, on the cover of Time magazine. And in that period of December, late December, but especially January 1951, 1952, he was almost a savior. So when he died, and Colin Powell said at his funeral, this is a man that the United States owes more than any other man alive, he was telling the truth. And he didn't really get caught up with the MacArthur George Marshall, etc., Riley. He was very hurt, I'll finish with this, that late in life, he had been told that MacArthur was a big supporter of his. Said, Matt, it's the 8th Army's yours, Matt, you're doing a great job. When MacArthur was in his 70s, he gave an interview in which he said that Ridgway had no strategic vision and he was just playing back and forth across the 38th parallel. And he was a mediocre commander, and he would rate him 6th of the people who could have been there, 6th. And it's a very poignant moment in Ridgway's 2 memoirs where he says, I was shocked because General MacArthur had publicly assured me that I was his most loyal henchman, and he had all this confidence. I realize now, looking back at my life, that while he was doing this, he was giving private interviews and undermining, which had an effect on and he was very hurt by it. But yet, if you read in his memoirs, he's very brilliant what he says about MacArthur. MacArthur was a hero in World War II. He had obvious talents. If he had not had the Incheon landing, if we'd listened to the Joint Chiefs, we would have lost Korea. But strategically, he was a 19th century thinker who didn't realize the ramifications of nuclear threats. He did understand communism all too well, better than anybody in the United States at that time. Unfortunately, he didn't have the proper strategic response to it. So Ridgway thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. We're glad all of you came. It occurred to me at one point that if someone walked in the middle of this and didn't know what the topic was, and they heard the description of these people that have been the focus of our presentation, they might mistakenly think you were talking about deans. Crazy people. When you leave, you may want to pick up an announcement that we will have at the back of a conference that will be coming up in March that I think many of you will be interested in. It's called A Place in the World, a sense of place in the world. Geography, identity, civic engagement in modern America. It's being hosted by the Davenport Institute, which is our research and conference and outreach arm of the School of Public Policy. Pete Peterson, who's the director of it, is back here. And there is a collection of about a dozen of the most outstanding people that we could find anywhere in America as the speakers for this 2-day conference. It starts in the afternoon of Friday the 11th and goes through the day on Saturday on March 12th. So pick up one of those. We'd be delighted to have you join us for that. And thank you all for coming.